Let me try and explain Bowen Family Theory's 8 concepts in the most colorful and visually appealing way that I possibly can. My name is Oliver and I'm a family systems therapist, and I try and help people see that Bowen is not boring, mainly by making things neon pink and hoping that people are distracted long enough to sit through the entire video. But this is pretty much exactly how I help my clients understand themselves and their relationships in my private practice. But before we get into Bowen Family Theory's 8 concepts, I have to give you the 101 on thoughts, feelings, self, and other. This is going to be vital to understand, and I promise it helps make the 8 concepts of Bowen Family Theory much more digestible. Bowen was not as much of a fan of feelings as I am, and thought that they got in the way of making us make mature, healthy decisions. And I get where he's coming from, but actually I think feelings are kind of great, but only if they are balanced out with thoughts. Feelings are, in my mind, a source of information that we need to have in order to make the most informed decisions that we can make. Feelings, for example, sometimes have needs attached to them. If you're feeling hungry, I know it's a sensation, not a feeling, it tells us that you need food. But if you feel lonely, which is a feeling, that might tell you that you need some human contact or you need to call a friend. Bowen's issue was with us having too much feelings and not thinking about where feelings come from or using thoughts to regulate them. And I get that because if we were only led by our feelings, we would be acting much more irrationally. If you've ever had road rage, the number of tires that I would have slashed by now if I'd actually acted on irrational rage would be shocking. Too much feelings might mean that you have big volcanic tempers or big swings into sadness or depression. And if that were the case, we might not be making the best decisions that we can be, and we might not be operating in the best way in the world. So we need our thoughts to balance and understand our feelings and tone them down. But too much thinking, I think that can be dry and sterile. I don't know, so picture your stereotypical history professor droning on about 15th century Ming vases, and no offense if that is your thing, I just don't find porcelain that particularly interesting. But it is all historical information that's thought-based. But what about being in a relationship in which two people only talk about their opinions, which are thoughts, on the weather or politics or the latest episode of Bridget? These are all thought-based. And when there's not a balance of feelings, these can feel dry. And that is why intimacy and passion start to fade in some relationships. A healthy balance of feelings is what helps keep relationships vibrant, makes us feel connected to people. If you're a therapist watching this, think about a session in which a client just told you what had been going on in their week, and compare that to a session where a client is telling you their feelings about you and how angry they are at you. Which session are you going to be more likely to be sitting on the edge of your seat in? Which is the most exciting? Which type of session gets your heart racing the most? Feelings are where connection happens. Feelings are immediate and vibrant and enlivening. But think about also someone who spends too much time in fantasy. And fantasy is all thought-based, right? Someone who daydreams a lot, is in their head, isn't really connected with you because they're off in their own world. Or think about someone who worries too much about the future, and we'll come back to worry in a bit, but all of that is thinking and about the future. It takes you out of the moment, it takes you out of connection with others. As well as differentiating thoughts and feelings, in my messed up, colorful, and overly simplistic take on Bowen, we also have to take into account self. And this is where we start to talk about the family projection process, but more on that later. Self is obvious. We carry around an internal sense of ourself that helps us remember who we are, what we've been through, what we like for dinner. And we also carry around internal representations of other people too, and in particular, members of our family and anyone that is important to you. I know that I have one of my little dog who is not so little. So when I'm in the office working late, that internal representation of Gogo comes into my head and I remember him. Even though he's not with me, I recall that I need to pick him up from daycare or to take him for a walk. This internal representation of other people helps us keep relationships alive when that person isn't in front of us. Very important. Now, if you're in a relationship with someone, I would hope very much that the representations of self and other are nicely balanced and separate in both of you. If you're in a relationship with the person who thinks more about their self than the other person, which is you, I imagine it's not a very satisfying relationship. And perhaps it's one way you can think of narcissism, right? That's a person that's all about themselves and very little about the other person. Now, if you're watching this video, you're probably more prone to making the other person much more important than you. Of course, it means that you're very caring and considerate, but this can sometimes get you in trouble if you start sacrificing yourself, what you need and what you desire in favor of the other person. Does that sound familiar? It's quite common in healthcare professionals. And it sounds a lot like people pleasing, right? So this would mean I can't say no to going to your dinner party because your feelings of disappointment if I were to cancel on you are much more important than the fact that I'm tired and run down and really need to go to bed early. So I'm going to suck it up and go to your party at the expense of myself. In a lot of couples, you will see self and other mushing up. I call this a self and other situation. It's where one person can't really distinguish where they end and the other person begins. They can't really see the other person as being an individual. So they worry too much on their behalf or do too much on their behalf because internally they're not seeing the other person as separate. So differentiation of self is all about thoughts, feelings, self, and other. They make up the core of a person in my interpretation of Bowen's theory. And ideally, we want thoughts, feelings, self, and other to be nicely balanced and separate. And this is what Bowen called a fully differentiated person. Here's the bad news, though. He also said that no one is fully differentiated, including me, including you. In fact, we all look a bit more like that. So he put people on a spectrum of 1 to 100, with 100 being a fully differentiated person. This is the psychological ideal we need to be striving for. And at the other end, a person is 0. And this is probably a baby who doesn't really understand that they are a self or that they're a different person from their caregiver. As we get older, we hopefully move further up the spectrum and end up somewhere just to the left of the middle. And with some therapy and a lot of introspection, maybe we get to inch a little bit closer up to 100, but generally, we're all around the middle. Essentially, that means we're all a hot mess of thoughts, feelings, self, and other. And for Bowen theory and Bowen therapists, it means a lot more. The porous boundaries around a person with lower levels of differentiation means that they're going to be easily swayed by other people, for example, mainly their family. But you can also think of groupthink, like how mob mentality will take over people and, I don't know, decide to storm the Capitol or vandalize cars and streets when their soccer team loses. So it means that we can be influenced by other people. It means that we can be pulled in different directions depending on the group, depending on the crowd. And that does not happen with a person that is fully differentiated. A differentiated person can be in contact with other people and think about other people's thoughts and desires and wants and decide on how they're going to react versus respond automatically. Undifferentiated means that things are more automatic. We're more reactive versus responsive. And the goal here, we all want to be more responsive and less reactive. We want to decide. People are generally happier when we've got choices and decisions and are not on autopilot. So if you don't think this is true for you, let me give you some less blatant examples of how we are influenced by other people. If you're a therapist and you've ever worried after a session whether a client thinks you're a terrible therapist or not, or have you ever thought that your supervisor or your colleague is the type of therapist that you should be? Have you ever got frustrated with that client who won't do what you discussed in a session or doesn't do the homework that you assigned them? Were you worried that people would roll their eyes and judge you when you told them that you were becoming a therapist? So we're all influenced by other people, and that is a testament to having these porous boundaries and being undifferentiated. The big thing that I've not talked about yet is the thing that makes all the other Bowen Family Theory 8 concepts fit together nicely. And that thing is chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety is more of a background state of tension that persists over time. And there's research showing things between what Bowen talked about with chronic anxiety and the amount of cortisol, which is a stress hormone that we all have. And that cortisol level impacts everything. It has really significant long-term impacts on our health, mental health, and even epigenetics. Acute anxiety is the sort of anxiety we talk about more often. It's the response to an immediate situation. Like social anxiety is acute anxiety when we walk into a room full of people, or the anxiety we feel when we're about to give a presentation. It's a fight, flight, and freeze response. It's adrenaline fueled and tends to be short-lived. So let's do a quick recap. The epitome of psychological health, higher self, our best self, whatever you want to call it, looks like this. At least according to Bowen Family Theory. We are all made up of thoughts, feelings, self, and other. And we like them all to be separated out in equal size. This person responds to life rather than constantly being reactive. They make decisions based on principles and thoughts while considering their feelings. They have a sense of self that can think about other people but isn't swept up by groupthink. They tend to have healthy, rich, satisfying relationships. Most of us, though, look more like this. We're a hot mess of thoughts, feelings, self, and other. We are generally more reactive to life. Sometimes we make irrational, feelings-based decisions and live to regret them. Often we get too swept up in what other people think of us or influenced by others, and we tend to have relationships that are more complicated. So imagine this jug is filled with chronic anxiety. Which of these two people carries more of it? Which would you rather be? It's the undifferentiated one, right? The more differentiated you are, the less chronic anxiety you have. So the goal for all of us and all of our clients, if you're a therapist, is to become more differentiated, have less of this chronic anxiety, and be more responsive, less reactive, have more decisions, be able to think about our feelings, have feelings about our thoughts, know where you begin and you end, and the other person begins and the other person ends. If you are still with me, please do me a massive favor and let me know. And you can do that by hitting like, follow, share, or leaving me a comment. It lets me know that people are wanting more videos on this topic, and if that's the case, I'll keep making them. Now, to make things even worse, our levels of chronic anxiety can be filled up even higher when we go through stressful life events. We call them nodal events. So starting a new job, great, more anxiety. Starting a new career, more anxiety. COVID-19, 2 years of anxiety. Moving house, getting hospitalized. The thing to remember here is when chronic anxiety hits a certain point, it starts overflowing. We've only got a certain capacity for anxiety in our lives. But when this anxiety overflows, that is when we start seeing symptoms. Depression, anxiety, bipolar, acting out, drinking, affairs, all of the things that you see in your practice are due to, at least in regards to Bowen Family Systems Theory, is due to too much chronic anxiety. And the way out of it all is to become more differentiated, to separate out thoughts, feelings, self, and other, so that we have less of it. I think now we have all of the ingredients we need to start talking about Bowen Family Theory 8 concepts. And the first one is the nuclear family process. When two people with lower levels of differentiation get in a relationship, I envision that these porous boundaries actually allow people to overlap. And what that means is that all the chronic anxiety in one person gets shared. I think we actually have a bit of a fantasy that when we meet someone, we'll feel less of this chronic anxiety, but actually the opposite is true. If you're in a relationship with someone, you're probably stressed out. Because now we're living with all of our partner's anxiety as well as your own. And don't forget, we can always add more chronic anxiety to the mix that gets shared whenever life events come along. So getting married, having kids, moving in together, all of these are stressful events that adds more chronic anxiety to the mix. And again, when there's too much of it, at some point it starts overflowing and one person or both people will get symptoms. So the nuclear family process describes what Dr. Bowen observed going on in families and couples as a way that we tend to regulate all of this anxiety. When couples have too much of this anxiety, they will fork, which stands for fight, overfunction or underfunction, relationship triangles, and cutoff. And I apologize because I will be presenting them in a different order. And I know I'm not using the precise Bowen terminology, but I really, really like acronyms. F is for fight. So fight is what Bowen calls conflict. And there's 4 or 5 ways of thinking about conflict in a relationship. Imagine 2 people are in a relationship and pretend that there's some unconscious deep conversation that goes something like this. All of this chronic anxiety. If only you could be more like me and have some of the same thoughts, beliefs, and values and opinions as me, maybe I would feel less anxious. Yeah, that's it. I just need to change you to be more like me. Then we'd have less disagreements and then I'd feel less anxious. Brilliant. I am actually going to change you to be more like me. Why didn't I think of this before? Now, the problem, of course, is that nobody likes to be changed. The other person will resist it and push back on it, and that is actually what starts conflict. Number 2, when you're in conflict, you feel less close to someone and you can de-merge with them a little bit, albeit temporarily, to get a little bit of relief from all of that chronic anxiety. So you can think of conflict as a way of regulating chronic anxiety. You get a bit of relief from it. Number 3, when two people with lower levels of differentiation are in a relationship, they're probably not talking about their feelings or separating out their thoughts from their feelings, thinking about what they're feeling, having feelings about their thoughts, everything's mushed up. So that makes it very hard to think about what you're actually fighting about. You're more reactive, you're more snippy. So conflict can be seen as just the result of having lower levels of differentiation. People with higher levels of differentiation will disagree, sure, but they won't let a disagreement turn into a yelling match or go to the blame game. And speaking of the blame game, number 4, the blame game. When self and other are all mushed up, it's very hard to be accountable for your actions or to accept responsibility for your behaviors. And that is the essence of the blame game. You said you'd pick up the groceries tonight. Well, you said you'd pick up the kids last week and you didn't do that. Like, we just go back and forth, each person blaming the other, because we can't really hold on to our sense of self. We're not separate from the other person. Self and other are too close to be seen as separate, and so we just share the blame. The O in fork stands for overfunctioning, and the correct term is dysfunction in the spouse. So when two undifferentiated people are in a relationship, one option that we unconsciously, of course, have is for one person to take on more of that anxiety and the other person can take less. And what does that look like? Well, if you imagine anxiety as a force that makes you do something, you're much likely to act on that anxiety. It's energizing in a way, right? The person that takes on more of the chronic anxiety is going to worry more, talk more, do more. And the person with less anxiety is going to do less. We call the person who's taken on more of this shared chronic anxiety the overfunctioner, and they leave the other person with less anxiety to do less, and they're the underfunctioner. You might see a couple come into therapy because one partner is depressed or one is unemployed. And the depressed or unemployed one will be the problem. But I guarantee you it is the overfunctioner that called you, made the appointment, because they're the doer. They're the ones who are getting things done. And that's part of the problem. So we have to rebalance the anxiety more appropriately as part of therapy. And I've got another video on that right here. The other option we have with all of this chronic anxiety is emotional distance or cutoff. We can just distance ourselves from a relationship with our partners and check out. So the person that is creating the emotional distance is not separating out their thoughts, feelings, self, and other. They're not really aware of what their needs or wants are. They're just reacting automatically. All they know is that they need to get away from the relationship. It's too stressful. And it's the only option they have available to them until you can get them more into their feelings and get self and other back in balance. Bowen saw this happen too between generations of family members, and it's exactly the same concept. So if you're in a relationship with your parents and it's stressful, we want to reduce that tension between you and a caregiver. And one of the easy and obvious ways to do that is to just cut them off and not speak to them, because that relationship is too hard, it's too much, it's too stressful. An oddly specific example of this might be someone who grew up in London, let's say, and in their mid-20s moved to, I don't know, Los Angeles, just for example, and became a therapist. Just an example, of course. But that's because everyone has some degree of unresolved issues with their parents because no one in their family is differentiated. So if you don't quite believe me, you can think about this. Do you feel guilty when you talk to your parents or family and feel like you should be doing more or could be doing more for them? Do you get sucked into family drama to resolve conflict between two people in your family? Have you ever noticed when you go home, you repeat the same arguments with family members or act a little more childlike? This is all to do with that overlapping we have between ourselves and our parents. It's just another relationship, and that chronic anxiety lives on in all of our relationships. Moving countries, cities, or just not speaking to anyone really doesn't resolve this anxiety. The thing that does resolve it, though, is doing the work and becoming more differentiated and changing yourself with changing your own boundaries and changing how you relate and speak to other people. Relationship triangles. So imagine in a relationship, a person starts emotionally distancing themselves by getting more involved in work or does more drinking or has an affair. I think you could look at that as a form of a relationship triangle. Their way of dealing with anxiety between two core people is to alleviate or to vent some of that tension to another person. Now, some people in Bowen theory don't really like talking about objects as a triangle, but it kind of works for me. A job is a triangle sometimes in a relationship because it alleviates the tension between two people. You get to put your focus on your work and your job, not the issues going on in your relationship. Similarly, venting to your mum about your partner is a triangle. One of the reasons that we have a no secrets policy in couples therapy is to prevent us from being triangled into a relationship and allowing one partner to vent to us, pulling us into a triangle. Triangles always have two people on the inside and one person on the outside. So actual couples therapy, when you're all talking about things together, is not a triangle, because even though there's three people in the room, you as a therapist are not taking sides. It's only when you start colluding with one other person that it would probably become a triangle in Bowen theory. If you're a therapist and you work with kids, you will constantly be triangled into a relationship between a parent and the child. So if you get calls or emails or texts from a parent saying, hey, you need to talk to my kid about why their math grade is so bad, you're being triangled into a relationship. Instead of the parent talking directly to the child about why their math grade is so bad, the parent is getting you to do it. So you're being put on the inside of the triangle while the parent gets to dip out and be on the outside. The tension and the blow up is going to be between you and the child, not the parent and the kid. And you probably don't want to encourage that, because in actual fact, what really needs to happen is we want people to be talking directly to each other about their thoughts and feelings, and obviously keeping self and other nice and separate. The family projection process. Another example of a triangle is when two parents triangle in their own child in a slightly different way, but not that dissimilar, but we call it the family projection process. It's the way that two parents can transmit their emotional problems in their relationship into their child. And it's the way you can conceptualize like 95% of all issues going on with teenagers, in my humble opinion, and actually my professional opinion, because I ran a treatment center for teenagers. When two parents are dealing with all of the anxiety with their co-parent or partner, one way they can distract themselves from it is to focus on their child, usually out of fear that something's wrong. Okay. Thoughts plus anxiety equals worry. Thoughts plus anxiety plus other equals focus on another. And it starts with a worry that the child has got, a touch of ADHD. And the parent worries that maybe the child got it from them. And then the parent starts watching the child a little bit more. Maybe the kid does have ADHD. Maybe they don't. But it really doesn't matter, because the impact of the parent's focus on the other actually influences the child's behavior. And you can relate to this if you've ever had a manager or supervisor that micromanages you. It's so stressful having everything that you do questioned or watched. It actually makes some people more flustered, and then they make more mistakes. And then the supervisor or manager watches you even more with even more scrutiny. And then we're in that sort of self-fulfilling cycle here. But in families, the parents treats the child as if something is actually wrong and takes them to the doctors. And then there's a diagnosis and a label and medication and an IEP. So we're in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then the child becomes the IP. One of the interesting things here for me is if there are other children in the family who are not subjected to this anxious focus on other, they're the ones that are doing fine in school. They are less needy, more goal-oriented, and probably more differentiated. A little side note here, this idea of anxious focus on other is not limited to parents and children. One partner can absolutely anxiously focus on the other. And you'll hear a lot about that in individual therapy if your client is always talking about their partner, and obviously in couples therapy when there's one partner with the problem. In family systems theory, we're talking about the reciprocity of relationships. The systems part of family systems is that we're all connected. One person doesn't have an issue in isolation. It's in relationship that problems are formed. The same thing can happen in work or in teams. We can anxiously focus on a person who's not performing well. And when you combine that with the idea of groupthink that we just talked about, where people get swayed and get some mob mentality, what tends to happen is that one person in the group or the team becomes the scapegoat or the black sheep. The scapegoat or the problem child will absolutely react consciously or unconsciously to this anxious focus on them, which in turn reinforces the idea that there's something wrong with them, and the team would be better off if they would just leave or get fired. The multi-generational transmission process is an extension of this, because without therapy and without an understanding of what's going on, we're predisposed to repeat things we learned from our parents and reenact those kind of things with our kids in a sort of continuous cycle. So let's talk about a fictitious client called Jenny, who I worked with on differentiating herself from her family. She was in her late 20s. She was very lost. She didn't know what she wanted to do and was quite reactive, deciding whether or not she should just quit everything and move to San Francisco. That's a lot of reactivity, right? So it was only when I went back some generations to really understand the big picture of what was going on and explain it that she started getting it. And it didn't come to a surprise as to me that somewhere in her ancestry, there were grandparents that escaped Europe at the start of World War II. They'd seen a huge amount of violence, death, persecution before moving to the US. Now, I don't think the term PTSD was used before World War II, so no one was diagnosed with it. But you can imagine there are thousands upon thousands of traumatized people coming from Europe who had horrific PTSD and then got married and had kids in a strange country. No blame or judgment, obviously, it's just what happened. So they started family and raised kids with huge amounts of trauma and anxiety from what happened to them. And then their kids have kids. And I think that is the generation of 20 to 30-year-olds who are coming to see me. Now, do you think that Jenny's parents were raised in an environment where people were talking about their feelings? Or do you think that perhaps their parents were more anxiously focused on them or distant and cut off? Of course, it's the latter, because there were a generation of people who were anxious and traumatized raising kids. And when they grew up and had kids, we start repeating the same thing. Now, there's also this idea in Bowen theory literature that I see that we're more likely to connect and marry with someone who's got a similar level of differentiation as ourselves. And I can't remember if I've seen it being disproved, or at least it isn't 100% confirmed, but in my very small sample size of my career, I can probably say that it is kind of true. No matter what your parents' lineage, you're going to find someone who's got the same level of differentiation as you. And therefore, you're more likely to pass that on to your kids unless you do this work. Sibling position is number 7. And I'm not entirely sure if I've read enough research on sibling positions to know whether I can fully get behind sweeping generalizations like the position in your family determines your likelihood of divorce, or whether an older brother marrying an older sister means that divorce is less likely. I've seen mixed research, but what I do fully believe is that each sibling has a different set of parents. I know that sounds weird, but hear me out. So the first child comes along and you've got 2 very anxious parents who have no idea what they're doing with the baby, and they will act in a certain way. Maybe that kid gets spoiled, or maybe gets a certain amount of attention for every developmental milestone that they reach, which is celebrated hugely. This undoubtedly has an impact on how that child's personality is formed and how they see themselves and their sense of self in general. When the second child comes along, maybe a few years later, maybe the parents are more relaxed. Maybe they've done this once before and they're not quite as anxious. Maybe those developmental milestones aren't quite as extraordinary the second time round and aren't as celebrated as much. Besides, they've got another kid running around now who's using their words and demanding more attention. So kid number 2 doesn't get the full attention of both parents like kid number 1 did. And perhaps potentially both parents are slightly more relaxed anyway. So kid number 1 had a different set of parents from kid number 2. And that has to impact the way that you grow up and see yourself. But what if the first 2 kids were boys and the third child is a girl? How does having a girl impact mom, who's been outnumbered by boys so far? How does that impact dad, who may or may not have a soft spot for daddy's little girl? So as much as parents will loathe to admit this, they will have absolutely had different levels of anxiety when each child came along, and in turn, parented differently, which impacts how a person sees themselves. I think there might be too many factors involved to make generalizations about only children and firstborn sons, but I do think it is worth exploring how anxious parents were around the first, second, or third child, and perhaps more importantly, how each child perceived their parents. The final of the 8 concepts of Murray Bowen's family theory is the societal emotional process. And I've already touched on that a few times, because what it means basically is that the same principles exist in work, organizations, culture, and countries. Just think about that conversation we had about groupthink and scapegoats, how teams work together. I had a boss once who constantly talked about the weakest link, and he was anxiously focused on whoever the poor soul was who was the subject of his anxious focus. The other idea I had was that the longer I've been a therapist, the more I noticed the difference between working with other therapists and non-therapists. There's just a different way of communicating and speaking to each other that's more subtle but different. I think maybe therapists are a bit more aware, a little more differentiated, and they've done some work in their own therapy. And as a result, things are more direct and easier to navigate for me. Plus, we like talking about our feelings. But on a societal level, you can think about how you can see people in society talking about different things in different ways. I think at one point in time, addicts were the problem, and those addicts were all responsible for all problems in the world. And, that term became a negative label. And that was a sort of societal groupthink, a societal anxious focus on other. And in a way, it was to alleviate our own anxiety by finding fault in others. Right now, there's an election on the horizon in November. It's the middle of summer now, but I can already feel anxiety about who the next president is going to be in my clients. I'm also aware that until recently, I'd happily have the news on in the background all day in my house just as background noise, but I just cannot do it anymore. All the election talk and the political landscape makes me too anxious. And come November, I suspect my office will get even busier because this chronic anxiety that we're getting from the outside will be producing symptoms in people who will need therapy for it. Okay, so those were Bowen's 8 concepts, and I would love to hear from you if you want more videos like this. Please leave me a comment if you want a specific video on a particular Bowen subject, or for me to expand on anything that I've said. I love hearing from you, whether it's a comment, a like, or a share. It lets me know that people kind of want this information and lets me know that I should keep these videos coming.